Diary of a Psychopath. Entry 1. The Diagnosis. From the memoir of Charles C. Caldwell, who took the lives of countless victims before he reached the age of 13. This book is dedicated to those who died. Abridged by Austin Thomas. Charles has an IQ score of over 190, said Dr. Birch, his words dry from shock. 193, actually. I watched his lips move. They were flat, colorless, as I imagined all doctors' mouths must look. A little chapped. The skin around them was pitted and tinted by that grown-up stubble that I would someday come to possess. There were patches of red rosacea near his chin, and he needed dental work for sure. The teeth were wearing against one another, set in the gums like eye shingles. They were yellowing from years of too much coffee. "Charles, did you hear him?" said Mother's voice from somewhere next to me. I woke from a deep concentration of my psychologist's mouth and found him beaming back at me, his fingers locked together on the desk between us. We were in his office. Behind him was an artificial ficus benjamina tree. Above that were two framed photographs, one of a tropical rainforest, the other of a desert. Framed boldly alongside them was Jonathan Birch's Ph.D. in developmental psychology. The room wasn't large, but there was space for several bookshelves. It smelled strongly of paper, a dull, foreign scent that seemed to me to be gray. The building was gray. Dr. Birch was gray. "This will open up so many doors for you. That's wonderful." I supposed it was Dr. Birch, a 12 years younger Dr. Birch, who had also diagnosed me with autism spectrum disorder when I was an infant, a condition that was not severe, but mildly present. I had never forgiven him for it. The diagnosis had not helped me in any way, and I'd never been treated. It was a label for grown-ups to use, a label for them to know me by. My name, it seemed, was not enough. Charles Caldwell was not enough. And now, the existing labels of autism and synesthesia and obsessive-compulsive disorder were married to a new concept, one which I had watched roll after Dr. Birch's tongue and birth from his lips in a single wind. Prodigy. His tie was tight around his neck, running stiffly downward from his collar. It was striped, alternating flashes of offensive green and pink. The flashes were slanted at a 30-degree angle. I hated those stripes. There was no reason for them. They were off balance, angled. It was chaos. I didn't want to live in a world where those stripes were acceptable and people like Dr. Birch wore them on neckties. There's a scene in Mr. Bean's Holiday in which clumsy Mr. Bean had accidentally inserted his necktie into a vending machine and got himself stuck. I imagine that happening to Dr. Birch, the machine reeling him in, his face smushed cartoonishly against the plastic, that hellish tie being slowly devoured by the dollar slot. Dr. Birch struggles against the tie, but he's gasping for air, his face turning red up to the roots of his white hair. I imagined at some point he goes unconscious. He eventually passes, the green and pink tie irreversibly lost inside the machine's esophagus. And after that, I don't know. But I didn't say any of this. I said, "Yes, Mother, I heard him. That's wonderful." But was it wonderful? It was hardly news. The other children my age were Neanderthals. Surely, intelligent grown-ups like Dr. Birch and my own mother knew that. They had to have known I was different, that I was special. Only an imbecile could observe a Lyle Hopkins with his rock collection, or Tracy Springfield with her jump ropes, or Chris Sullivan with his 52 in grammar, and think I was somehow amongst them, somehow on their plane of existence. I found the very idea insulting. At age 3, I could recite the periodic table in order of atomic weight, third in the science fair each year with staggering ease. I've taught myself a dozen languages, I've read 100 textbooks, and my vocabulary alone exceeds whatever primitive eloquence my peers vomit out by the way of text messages. The only mathematics test I'd ever failed was the second grade, and I insist to this day that it was not my fault. I'd missed the row of bubbles at the top of the answer card and misprinted every single answer starting from the beginning. I pestered Mrs. White religiously to allow me to retake, but she wouldn't have it. Mrs. White hated boys. I hated her. Mrs. White died of a brain aneurysm a month later. My classmates, though dense, were distraught. We'd spent all year with Mrs. White. Some of the girls wept openly when they heard the news. Their ugly faces became prunes of wrinkled red flesh. Tears came out of their eyes in waterfalls. I watched their reactions, curious as to how such a passive relationship between teacher and student could evoke such torment in a person. To my recollection, I'd only ever experienced that reaction from physical trauma. I'd cried like those girls had the day I burnt my hand on the stove. But Mrs. White was no burnt hand. She affected our lives in no way at all. There'd been a meeting at the flagpole outside to pray for Mrs. White's family. It was a massive overreaction. All of it. I did not cry. I did not bugle my disapproval of Mrs. White's untimely death. I felt nothing for Mrs. White because I owed her nothing. She left a sinful scar on my GPA, but in the end, I won. Dr. Birch and his tie explained our options from here on out. I could stay at Greenwater Elementary, this hellhole I had endured since kindergarten, yet not one of my parents had the decency to put me in gifted classes for reasons that even I was unsure of. Or I could attend a private institution, a far healthier, almost dreamlike possibility in my opinion, but one which might ruin my parents' joint bank account. I relished the idea of a private school. More than anything, perhaps I relished the idea of being away. Away appears in my mind as a vibrant blue spectrum composed of beaches and summer skies and fields of blue bonnets. The word itself is placid with the Y at the end, adding a nice, vibrantly yellow ray of sunshine. You do not find the comfort and bliss of away at Greenwater Elementary School. At Greenwater Elementary School, you found children your age with less than half your IQ. Pardon my ego, but at some point we must beg the question, at what point does one become a big fish in a small pond? It was last week that the question of my intelligence finally came to fruition. Not my realization, of course. I had suspected my own superiority long before anyone else, and it was in fact a mother who suggested one humble Tuesday night that I might be a prodigy. Different. The subject came up over dinner. Gray roast beef and mashed potatoes, green beans, that only Mother and I and Richard is not my father, was not my father, and will never be my father. My biological father died a year after I was born. His name was also Charles Caldwell. He was a chemist, and it was to my great disappointment that I would never meet him. What I could have felt for him would perhaps be akin to what I felt for my own mother. Not love. Love was something I had never known and had no desire to attain, but a certain professional respect. I did not respect Richard. He was Mother's current husband. That much was hard to ignore, but he was not my father. I would not allow that. Richard was unemployed and had a severe addiction to alcohol. He was the kind of man to wear white sleeveless shirts and smoke cigarettes in the house. His skin was wrinkled and spotted by long exposure to the sun. It pruned the tattoos along his arms and chest. Someday, I suspected Richard would have skin cancer. It was merely a premonition of mine, but occasionally it was fringed with crimson desire. Mother suggested over dinner that I excel in every class, particularly science and mathematics. The subject came up timidly, but it was spontaneous. I'd been listening to the musical chime of forks and knives across our porcelain plates. At the mention of this, the sound began to die. There was a hint of fear in Mother's voice that I doubted Richard had the capacity to hear. His bright eyes stared at her out of darkened crow's feet, and he said, "So what? You want to send him to a different school? Some kind of prissy private institution that I have to pay for?" Mother said no, not yet, though I sensed she would like to have done exactly that. She said that we would think about it, and she said that she would have my intelligence tested to have a ballpark estimate of my capabilities. She said the public school was holding me back, and that was for sure. Richard didn't say anything. He just watched her and took a swig of something Mother had long ago convinced me was damn near close to poison, along with the skin cancer. I suspected Richard may already be accumulating irreversible liver damage. "Charles, go to your room," said Richard quietly. Not watching me, but my mother still. She was watching him back. The music of the forks had stopped completely. The scoot of my chair drilled through the silence, and I walked out of the dining room, feeling a cloud of tension close behind me. My bedroom door was exactly 16 stairs up, 32 round trip, which I knew because I liked to count the steps each time I went up and down. I did this unconsciously. My mind simply absorbed the numbers with no willful effort. My room had baby blue walls and a singular window. There were posters of Dmitri Mendeleev and Albert Einstein across the walls. Science fair ribbons and math contest trophies were neatly arranged on shelves. A first-place spelling bee plaque was framed on one wall, right over my desk, which bore a microscope and many, many books. I liked reading textbooks and encyclopedias. Reading was perhaps one of my favorite hobbies. I particularly enjoyed the Merriam-Webster dictionary and its plethora of words. The dictionary was a good friend. Well-organized, balanced, professional, alphabetized, systematic, designed. The thesaurus was nice too. I laid in my bed and continued reading from R to S. I reached the word saccharometer before the shouting below invaded my catalog train of thought. The shouting was muffled and distant, but there was nothing I could do to drown it out. It came from both Mother and Richard, a two-way debate from which I could only make out the occasional swear. Then there was a magenta smack, and a distant scream from Mother, and an angry shout from Richard, more shouting, smack, smack, smack. That was funny, I thought. Not the abuse, the simple fact that it was usually in my ability to drown out the shouting with organized words from the dictionary. Now the words on the page became a rainbow jumble of meaninglessness. My concentration was a wreck, an infirmity to which I previously thought myself to be immune. All I could hear were smacks ringing in my ears and echoing in my skull, and then shouting. I shut the book, thinking to myself that I needed to get out of here and reach a more controlled world. I needed to regain my train of thought and get the abuse out of my head. Chemistry, of course, never failed to get my mind off things. I shared a fondness for all science, but chemistry dominated the others. If for nothing other than its structure, the atoms, the elements, the universe, all structured, precise, clean. My chemistry kit was in the garage. If I got my hands on that, it would merit all of my concentration. I would stop hearing the smacks if I focused on chemistry. I opened my bedroom door, and the 16 stairs of the staircase seemed to stretch to infinity in some sort of vertigo effect. The stairs creaked with my footsteps. I quieted my pace so Richard would not overhear. As I reached the bottom stair, the shouting from the kitchen intensified, Richard yelling hoarsely in a drunken stupor. Smack. Mother screaming. This usually did not affect me as it did this night. Was it guilt? In all its awkward glory? Did I feel guilt because this altercation was founded on my very education? Perhaps. I found my chemistry kit set on the shelf in the garage. Around it were Richard's tools, rusty and black with disuse. My chemistry kit was pristine. I used it often and only stored it here to keep chemicals away from my tidy room. I heaved it to the concrete floor and unlatched it. The container was something humorous in retrospect. It prominently displayed happy children wearing goggles on the front and a mild warning for ages 9+. The contents were hardly something you would hand to a 9-year-old. I depleted the initial supplies long ago and had been replacing them with stolen chemicals from school ever since. It wasn't hard. Mrs. Allen, the chemistry instructor at Greenwood Elementary, had a supply closet full of toxicities which she rarely locked. My chemistry set was a child-friendly facade which contained some quite lethal contents. I didn't worry about Richard finding it. I doubt he understood or cared about the properties of the chemicals inside. For the past 2 weeks, I'd been researching and experimenting to synthesize something like antifreeze. There was no real application for this. I simply wanted to do it for sport. Thanks to Mrs. Allen's unlocked supply closet, I was able to obtain a fair amount of ethylene glycol. For this specific chemical, there were many applications. It was also used in the production of polyester fibers and polyethylene terephthalate resin. It was a lucky find. I pulled on rubber gloves and goggles as a precaution, then measured out a volumetric flask of ethylene glycol. I set it aside and got to work mixing additives in a beaker of distilled water. These steps were not unfamiliar to me. I had been concocting batches of antifreeze using different measurements to verify what the effects would be. This time, I altered the recipe only slightly and expected only a subtle change. I used a small plastic lid to empty out approximately 15 milliliters of the glycol, then set it aside and returned to my project. 10 minutes hadn't passed before my concentration was interrupted once more, not with shouting this time, but a whining plea. I turned around to discover an unwanted visitor, in this case, a gray and black Maine Coon. The cat had wandered in through the open garage door and now sat on the concrete floor, watching me with bugged eyes. "What do you want?" I heard myself say. The cat meowed again, not a hello, but a hungry beg. His little nose bobbed in the air, sniffing something. Must have been the glycol. Ethylene glycol is known for its sweetness, which is precisely what made it such a potent attraction to small children and animals. When ingested, however, ethylene glycol oxidized into acutely toxic oxalic acid. A sufficient dose would cause a direct shutdown of the central nervous system, heart, and eventually the kidneys. Privately, I wondered how long such a fatal process could take in this animal. You know what they say about curiosity in the cat. I shielded my supply of glycol. The cat mewed again, this time coming forward to stroke its face along the back of my hand. "No," I said, "not for you." Somehow within myself, I felt my heart disagree. Who was I to tell this cat what he could have? No good had ever come from man's attempt to deter nature's will. It was always in our best interest to let nature run its course. More precious sacrifices had to be made in the name of science before. Oddly enough, I watched my own hand slide the glycol towards the Maine Coon. But curiosity kills the cat, does it not? The cat moved forward, sniffed the substance, and lapped greedily from the cap. I abandoned my experiment to watch. This was my new experiment, and one far more important. What practical purpose did I have for the antifreeze anyway? Here I had a willing organism partaking in a lethal substance that would surely work wonders in a few short hours. And what did that make me? An enabler? I settled on calling myself a mere observer. An observer of nature running its course. The thought, suddenly new in my mind, surged through me in bright, vibrant yellow. Here was an opportunity to observe the true effects of ethylene glycol at work. My heart began to race. I stood and closed the garage door, shutting out the light. Now it was dark, and my visitor had no choice but to stay. He hardly cared. The cat remained at the plastic cup, licking up the chemical. Eventually he stopped, licked his lips, and trotted back towards the garage door. Then he looked around, perhaps confused, trotted around the garage a bit more, and then finally settled down next to Richard's old golfing bag. His little head rested on his paw, and his eyes shut tight. A small flutter of excitement, like an electric shock on a cold winter morning, briefly illuminated the back of my mind as the reality of the situation hit me. This cat, which had so fortunately meandered into the garage, would soon be dead. The experiment was now rerouted to a new plane of existence. My chemistry set was no longer a child's plaything. If remorse is what I should have felt, it was not that. I merely felt an ecstasy that suggested I was no longer an elementary student, but a pawn of science. I sat cross-legged on the floor and listened to the muffled shouting from inside the house. I might have sat there, watching that cat for an hour, maybe 2. I reflected over what this meant for me. what this could breed regarding my future scientific endeavors. I convinced myself that Richard's treatment of Mother and myself had nothing to do with this sudden morbid fascination. And perhaps that was true, or perhaps it wasn't. At last I stood and approached the sleeping cat. He did not acknowledge me. And when I cradled his head in my arms, he did not awaken. My mind filled with vibrant, glistening sunlight. Mother talked to Dr. Birch for a little while. Her mouth moved too. The lips were red, full of lipstick and life. There was some lipstick on her teeth too, but the teeth were mostly white. The skin around her mouth was caked in makeup, but it was pretty. It was young. Then Dr. Birch's ugly mouth and my mother's pretty one talked some more. They were having a fluid conversation. Slowly I realized that no sound was coming from their mouths, but I was simply watching the lips speak, squelch in and out as their chins moved up and down, a dead ringing slowly in the depths of my ear. Then I felt my mother's hand touch mine, and I looked up at her, and her lips moved as she said, "Time to go, Charles. We've got to tell your father the wonderful news." "Yes," I said. "I can't wait." I stood up slowly, shakily, from the chair. I could feel that my bow tie had gone askew, so I straightened it as best I could without a mirror. Dr. Birch in his tie looked at me curiously, perhaps jealously. Perhaps Dr. Birch was envious of my bow tie, because mine was perfect. Mine was easily more professional, more likable, more orderly. His just hung there, the corpse of some ill fish, the stripes so dreadfully askew that one could vomit. The pink and green leered at me, and suddenly those colors did make me feel ill, a deep sickness that felt both disorienting and unstoppable. "Now what do you say, Charles?" My mother teased once we reached the office door. "What do you say to Dr. Birch for letting you take the test?" Dr. Birch looked at me with his white hair, with his grown-up stubble, with his glasses and tie and dried ugly lips. He was smiling at me, revealing his coffee-stained grill. I said, "Brush your teeth." The smile faded.